You're about to lose the easiest $2,000 of your life. The words cut through the academy like a referee's whistle, sharp enough to pull every head toward the center mat. A few students laughed immediately. Others exchanged knowing smiles. Phones appeared in hands. Even the parents watching from the glass viewing area leaned forward, sensing the start of a spectacle. Ethan Mercer stood beneath the bright fluorescent lights with the confidence of a man who had spent years being the best athlete in every room he entered. His black belt rested around his waist like a crown. Behind him, banners from regional tournaments hung across the walls. Framed photographs showed him standing on podiums, shaking hands with champions, holding trophies high above his head. Ethan pulled a crisp stack of $100 bills from his gym bag and tossed it onto the edge of the mat. The money landed with a soft slap that somehow sounded louder than the conversations that instantly died around it. $2,000, he announced. She doesn't make it 60 seconds. More laughter followed. Some students nodded. A few looked uncomfortable but said nothing. Standing several feet away was Aaliyah Brooks. She didn't react. She didn't argue. She didn't even glance at the money. Instead, her eyes drifted toward her own hands. Long fingers. Faint calluses. Small scars earned from years of work that nobody in the building knew anything about. The room saw a black woman wearing a simple training GI. They saw someone quiet. Someone unfamiliar. Someone who didn't fit the image of a competitor. What they didn't see was the exhaustion behind her eyes after a 14-hour overnight shift at St. Matthew's Medical Center. Just 3 hours earlier, she had been standing beneath very different lights. Hospital lights. Bright white lights reflecting off polished floors and stainless steel equipment. She had spent the night moving from room to room, comforting frightened families, checking monitors, and helping patients through some of the hardest moments of their lives. Near dawn, a young boy had finally stabilized after a medical emergency that had kept an entire team awake for hours. When his mother broke into tears of relief, Aaliyah had simply smiled, squeezed her shoulder, and quietly stepped away. No applause. No audience. No trophies. Just another shift. Just another life touched. By the time she arrived at Mercer Jiu-Jitsu Academy, the morning sun had barely climbed above the rooftops. The parking lot still glistened from a light rain that had passed through before sunrise. Most people would have gone home to sleep. Aaliyah came to train. She always came to train. Inside the academy, however, nobody knew her story. To them she was just the woman who showed up, tied her belt, listened carefully, and left without trying to impress anyone. She never posted training videos online, never talked about accomplishments, never corrected people unless she felt someone might get hurt. She preferred silence. The academy buzzed around her now. Students whispered. Someone chuckled near the wall. Ethan folded his arms and smiled wider as if the outcome had already been decided. The stack of cash remained on the mat between them, a challenge sitting under the bright lights for everyone to see. Aaliyah finally lifted her gaze from her hands and looked across the room. The laughter continued. The cameras remained pointed in her direction. And yet her expression never changed. Calm, steady, almost thoughtful. As if she had seen moments exactly like this before. Aaliyah could feel dozens of eyes following her, but she had learned long ago that attention was not the same thing as respect. The academy smelled faintly of disinfectant, rubber mats, and fresh coffee from the small reception desk near the entrance. Morning sunlight filtered through the tall front windows, casting long rectangles of gold across the training area. Around her, conversations continued in hushed voices. Some students glanced at the stack of cash and smirked. Others stared at Ethan as though they were waiting for permission to laugh again. Aaliyah ignored all of it. She stepped toward the bench along the wall and carefully set down her gym bag. The zipper opened with a soft sound. Inside were the same things she carried every day. A water bottle. An extra pair of scrubs from the hospital. A folded notebook. Nothing about the bag suggested accomplishment. Nothing about it hinted at the years she had spent sacrificing sleep, comfort, and free time for goals that most people would never understand. Ethan watched her from across the mat. His confidence seemed to grow with every second she remained silent. To him, silence looked like uncertainty. To Aaliyah, silence was simply discipline. She removed her watch and placed it inside the bag. Then she folded her navy blue jacket with deliberate care. The small ritual seemed oddly out of place compared to the excitement building around her. It was almost as if she were preparing for an ordinary training session instead of a public challenge. One of the younger students shook his head. "She looks nervous," he whispered. His friend nodded immediately. "I would be too." Neither of them knew that Aaliyah had spent years walking into situations far more stressful than a crowded martial arts academy. She remembered a winter storm 3 years earlier when an ambulance arrived carrying multiple patients after a highway pileup. The emergency department had been overflowing. Monitors beeped from every direction. Families cried in waiting rooms. Snow hammered against the hospital windows. Through all of it, she had remained calm because panic never solved anything. Focus did. The memory faded as she looked around the academy. The room felt smaller now. Quieter. Anticipation hung in the air like static before a thunderstorm. Ethan finally stepped forward. "You still have time to change your mind," he said with a grin that drew a few more laughs from nearby students. Aaliyah met his eyes. "I am fine," she replied softly. Her voice carried no anger, no challenge, just certainty. That certainty unsettled a few people more than confidence would have. Across the room, an older man sitting near the viewing area narrowed his eyes. He had been watching her carefully ever since she arrived. There was something familiar about the way she moved. Not dramatic, not flashy, efficient, controlled. The kind of movement that came from years of repetition. He could not place it yet, but the feeling lingered in the back of his mind. Ethan seemed not to notice. He was too busy enjoying the attention. Students gathered closer to the mat. Several phones remained pointed toward the center of the room. Someone even opened a live stream. The challenge was already becoming entertainment. Aaliyah finished folding her jacket and stood upright. Her shoulders relaxed. Her breathing remained steady. Outside, a light breeze moved through the trees lining the parking lot. Inside, the noise slowly faded. The excitement. The whispers. The laughter. One by one, they disappeared into an uneasy silence. For the first time that morning, the room no longer felt certain about what was about to happen. Across the academy, Ethan rolled his shoulders and smiled as though the morning had already ended in his favor. Confidence followed him everywhere. It lived in the framed certificates on the walls, in the championship photos near the entrance, and in the way students instinctively stepped aside when he walked past. Years of victories had built a reputation that few people questioned. For many of the younger members, Ethan Mercer was not simply an instructor. He was proof that hard work led to success. That reputation had earned him admiration, but somewhere along the way it had also created a dangerous habit. He had stopped expecting to be surprised. The room slowly rearranged itself around him. Students formed a wide circle around the center mat. Some sat cross-legged against the wall. Others leaned forward with folded arms. The receptionist paused her paperwork. Even people who had originally come for the next class remained where they were, curious to see what happened next. Ethan seemed energized by the attention. He thrived in front of an audience. Aaliyah noticed it immediately. She had seen similar personalities before. Doctors who believed experience made them incapable of mistakes. Administrators who assumed a title meant they understood everything. People who confused authority with wisdom. In the hospital, those attitudes usually disappeared the moment reality challenged them. Here, however, Ethan still seemed completely comfortable. He pointed toward the center of the mat. "Come on," he said. Casually. "Let us see what you have." His tone sounded friendly enough to some listeners, but beneath it sat something else. Dismissal. The assumption that the outcome was already decided. Aaliyah walked forward without hurry. The soft texture of the mat pressed beneath her bare feet. The room grew quieter with every step. Near the viewing area, the older man continued watching her. The feeling of familiarity had become stronger now. He studied the way she carried herself. Her posture remained balanced. Her eyes moved calmly across the room without lingering on anyone. There was no nervous energy, no attempt to impress, just patience. Suddenly, a memory surfaced. Several years earlier, he had attended a major tournament while visiting family in Atlanta. Hundreds of competitors had filled a convention center. One match in particular had stayed in his mind because of how unusual it was. A woman had defeated opponents without celebrating, without trash talk, and without drawing attention to herself. The old man frowned as he searched through the memory. Could it really be the same person? Before he could decide, a young student beside him spoke. This is going to be over fast. The old man glanced at the teenager and then back toward Aaliyah. Maybe, he answered quietly. Or maybe we do not know as much as we think we do. Meanwhile, Ethan was enjoying every second of the anticipation. He exchanged jokes with a few students. More laughter followed. The stack of cash remained untouched near the edge of the mat, almost glowing beneath the overhead lights. Yet something subtle had changed inside the room. The certainty that filled the academy earlier was beginning to crack. Not because of anything Aaliyah had said. She had barely spoken. It was because of what she had not done. She had not argued. She had not defended herself. She had not tried to convince anyone of her abilities. Instead, she stood calmly at the center of the mat as though she had already accepted whatever came next. Outside, clouds drifted slowly across the bright morning sky. Inside, every eye remained fixed on her. And for the first time since the challenge began, Ethan noticed that her calmness was not fading. If anything, it seemed to be growing stronger. The silence finally broke when one of the newer students stepped onto the mat to demonstrate a technique with Ethan. First, everything appeared routine. Ethan explained grips, positioning, and timing while the class watched closely. The student nodded, eager to impress. Then something small happened. A detail. A movement so subtle that most people missed it entirely. Aaliyah noticed the student's arm drifting slightly out of alignment during the demonstration. It was not dangerous, but it was inefficient. The kind of mistake that could become a habit if repeated often enough. She hesitated. For a moment she considered saying nothing. That would have been easier. She had learned long ago that offering help was not always welcomed, especially when the person receiving it believed they already knew everything. But the habit of helping people ran too deep inside her. It was the same instinct that made her check on nervous patients twice before ending a shift. The same instinct that made her stay a few extra minutes when a worried family needed reassurance. Before she could stop herself, she spoke. Her voice was calm and respectful. His elbow is a little too high. The words were simple, barely louder than a conversation. Yet the effect was immediate. The room seemed to pause. Ethan turned toward her. The student looked confused. Several people exchanged glances. Aaliyah continued carefully. If he lowers it slightly, the position becomes stronger. Nobody spoke for a second. Then a few students smiled awkwardly. Ethan stared at her. The smile on his face remained, but something behind it shifted. The expression no longer carried amusement. It carried challenge. Is that right? He asked. His voice sounded pleasant enough, but the atmosphere around him had changed. Aaliyah nodded once. That is how I learned it. Ethan laughed softly. A few students laughed with him. Well, he said, spreading his hands, maybe you should teach the class. More laughter followed. Louder this time. The kind of laughter people use when they want to stay on the winning side of a conversation. Aaliyah felt dozens of eyes. Returned to her. She did not react. The student stepped off the mat. Ethan remained in the center of the room. Actually, he continued, let us make this interesting. The energy inside the academy changed instantly. Conversations stopped. People straightened in their seats. Ethan walked toward the edge of the mat where the stack of cash still rested beneath the bright lights. He tapped it with 2 fingers. $2,000, he said. You and me. A few students gasped. Others immediately reached for their phones again. The challenge that had started as a joke suddenly felt real. Aaliyah looked at the money and then back at Ethan. The fluorescent lights reflected against the polished glass near the entrance. Outside, traffic moved slowly through the late morning sunshine. Inside, every person seemed frozen in anticipation. Ethan waited confidently. He expected hesitation. He expected excuses. He expected her to back away. Instead, Aaliyah simply looked at him with the same calm expression she had worn all morning. The room waited. The silence stretched longer and longer. And somehow that silence made everyone more uncomfortable than any argument could have. For several long seconds nobody moved. The challenge hung in the air, suspended between expectation and uncertainty. Ethan kept his eyes on Aaliyah, waiting for her answer. The corners of his mouth remained lifted in a confident smile. Around him, students shifted their weight, whispering predictions to one another. A few were already discussing how quickly everything would be over. Others quietly wondered whether she would simply walk away. After all, that was what most people would do. The pressure alone was enough to make many competitors uncomfortable. Yet Aaliyah stood perfectly still. The bright overhead lights reflected softly against the polished windows behind her. She could hear the hum of the air conditioning system, the faint buzz of a phone recording from somewhere near the wall, the distant sound of traffic outside. Everything felt strangely calm. Ethan finally broke the silence. "What is wrong?" he asked with a chuckle. "Having second thoughts?" Several students laughed again. One young man shook his head and folded his arms. "I would not blame her," he muttered. "Nobody lasts long against Coach Mercer." The comments spread through the group. Heads nodded. Confidence grew. The crowd was no longer watching a possible contest. In their minds, they were watching the beginning of an inevitable lesson. Ethan pointed toward the stack of money again. "You can still keep your pride," he said. "No one will think less of you." More laughter followed. Aaliyah listened without reacting. Years earlier, words like those might have bothered her. But life had taught her something valuable. People often revealed more about themselves than about others when they spoke from arrogance. She remembered a patient she had cared for months before. A successful businessman who arrived at the hospital frustrated and angry because nobody seemed to recognize his status. During one difficult night, he discovered that titles and money could not solve every problem. By morning, he had become one of the kindest people on the floor. Adversity had humbled him. Standing inside the academy now, Aaliyah wondered if Ethan had ever experienced a similar lesson. The atmosphere continued to tighten. A student near the front raised his phone higher for a better angle. Another quietly opened a group chat and began sending updates. The challenge was spreading beyond the room. Ethan seemed pleased by the attention. "Come on," he said. "At least tell everyone how long you think you can last." The remark drew another round of laughter. This time, however, the response felt different. A few people no longer seemed comfortable joining in. Something about Aaliyah's composure was beginning to affect the room. She had been mocked, challenged, and placed under a spotlight, yet she remained completely calm. Not defensive. Not angry. Just steady. The older man near the viewing area continued watching carefully. The memory nagging at him grew stronger with every passing minute. He leaned forward in his seat and studied her face. Then he looked at the way she stood. Balanced. Relaxed. Patient. Suddenly his eyes widened slightly. Not because he was certain yet, but because he was beginning to suspect something extraordinary. Meanwhile, Ethan interpreted her silence as surrender. He spread his hands dramatically and looked around the academy. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "I think we have our answer." A few people laughed once more. Others remained quiet. And in that growing silence, Aaliyah finally took a single step toward the center of the mat. Aaliyah's foot settled onto the center of the mat, and the room seemed to exhale all at once. Nobody laughed now. The energy that had fueled the challenge was still there, but it had changed shape. What had started as entertainment was becoming something else. Something quieter. Something harder to explain. Ethan remained confident, yet even he seemed slightly puzzled by her reaction. Most people placed under that kind of pressure either became defensive or eager to prove themselves. Aaliyah had done neither. She simply stood there. Calm. Present. Unshaken. The bright lights overhead reflected softly against the smooth surface of the training mats. Somewhere near the front desk, a coffee machine clicked as it finished brewing a fresh pot. Outside, sunlight filtered through drifting clouds, sending shifting patterns across the academy windows. The ordinary sounds of a normal morning continued beyond the walls, but inside the room time felt strangely slow. Aaliyah reached down and adjusted the sleeve of her GI. The movement was small and unhurried. Then she took a slow breath. Years of experience had taught her the value of moments like this. Not the moments of victory that people remembered. Not the moments that ended up in photographs. The quiet moments before decisions were made. Before outcomes revealed themselves. Before assumptions met reality. She remembered sitting beside her mother years ago during chemotherapy appointments. The waiting had always been harder than the news itself. They would sit together beneath cold fluorescent lights listening to distant conversations and rolling carts moving through hospital hallways. Her mother used to squeeze her hand and say the same thing every time. Stay calm. The truth arrives whether you worry or not. The memory warmed her heart even now. Cross the mat. Ethan stretched his shoulders and glanced toward the students gathered around the edges. Their attention fueled him. He smiled and nodded at a few familiar faces. Several nodded back eagerly. Yet the reaction felt different from earlier. The excitement remained, but certainty was beginning to disappear. Near the viewing area, the older man leaned forward again. He could almost see the forgotten memory clearly now. A large tournament venue. Hundreds of spectators. A competitor who never celebrated. A competitor whose calmness unsettled opponents more than any display of confidence ever could. He studied Aaliyah's face. Then her posture. Then the way she quietly observed everything around her. His pulse quickened. If his suspicion was correct, the room was about to learn something important. Not about technique. Not about competition. About judgment. Around the academy, phones remained raised. Screens glowed beneath the overhead lights. People waited for action. They expected a dramatic moment. A quick result. A story they could share before lunch. Instead, what they witnessed was silence. Aaliyah looked around the room one final time. She saw students, parents, curious spectators. She saw people who had already decided who she was without ever asking a single question. Yet there was no bitterness in her expression, only patience. Ethan finally stepped toward the center and extended a hand in preparation to begin. The academy fell completely silent. Even the whispers disappeared. In that stillness, surrounded by expectation, sunlight, and uncertainty, Aaliyah accepted the moment exactly as it was and waited for the truth to reveal itself. What happened next lasted only moments, yet it changed the atmosphere of the entire academy. The students who had been recording leaned forward. The parents behind the glass stopped talking. Even the receptionist forgot about the paperwork sitting on her desk. The challenge finally began, and the confidence that had filled the room all morning disappeared almost immediately. There was no dramatic celebration, no shouting, no display of emotion. There was only a brief exchange, a series of calm and precise movements, and then a result that nobody had expected. Silence crashed over the academy. Ethan stepped back first. His expression changed before anyone else could process what had happened. The certainty that had defined him all morning was suddenly gone. A few students blinked in confusion. Others looked at each other as if waiting for someone to explain what they had just witnessed. One phone slowly lowered. Then another. The room that had been preparing to laugh no longer knew what to say. Aaliyah remained exactly as she had been before. Calm, respectful, composed. She adjusted her sleeve and stepped away without a trace of celebration. That reaction confused people even more than the outcome itself. Most competitors would have smiled. Some would have enjoyed proving everyone wrong. Aaliyah did neither. She simply accepted the moment and moved on. The older man near the viewing area suddenly stood up. His chair scraped softly against the floor. Several heads turned toward him. His eyes were locked on Aaliyah. Not with surprise anymore. With recognition. "I knew it," he whispered. Nobody heard him at first. Then he took a few steps closer. "I knew I had seen her before." The words immediately drew attention. Students looked back and forth between him and Aaliyah. Ethan remained silent. The older man reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. His hands moved quickly across the screen. Seconds later he stopped and held the device up. "That is her," he said. "I knew it." Curious students gathered around. A photograph filled the screen. It showed a large competition venue packed with spectators. In the center stood a woman wearing a medal around her neck. The image was several years old, but the face was unmistakable. Aaliyah Brooks. A wave of confusion swept through the room. "Who is she?" someone asked. Another student leaned closer to the phone. Then his eyes widened. "Wait," he said quietly. "That Aaliyah Brooks?" More people crowded around. Searches began appearing across phones throughout the academy. Tournament results. Interviews. Competition photos. Recognition spread from one person to the next like a ripple moving across water. The woman they had dismissed as a quiet newcomer had spent years competing at an elite level. She had traveled across the country, won respected events, earned recognition that most people in the room could only dream about. Yet she had never mentioned any of it. Across the academy, whispers replaced laughter. Students who had confidently predicted the outcome moments earlier now stared in disbelief. Ethan looked from one face to another as the truth unfolded around him. For the first time that morning, he realized that nobody had misled him. Nobody had hidden anything. The only mistake had been assuming he already knew who Aaliyah was before ever taking the time to ask. A sudden stillness settled over Ethan Mercer. The phones, the whispers, the stunned faces around him all seemed distant now. He stood in the center of the academy while students continued scrolling through articles, tournament records, and photographs that revealed pieces of Aaliyah's past. Every new discovery deepened the silence. Yet the information that affected Ethan most was not the list of accomplishments. It was what came next. One student found an interview from several years earlier. Another discovered a local news story. A third located a charity event photograph. Gradually, a fuller picture emerged. Aaliyah had stepped away from competition at the height of her success. Not because she failed. Not because opportunities disappeared. She had left to care for her mother during a long battle with illness. After her mother's passing, she had chosen a career in healthcare and dedicated herself to helping others. The academy listened as fragments of her story spread from one phone to another. The details transformed the room. People who had viewed her as a stranger now saw years of sacrifice, years of discipline, years of choosing responsibility over recognition. Ethan lowered his eyes. The realization settled heavily on his shoulders. All morning he had assumed he understood exactly who stood across from him. He had judged her based on appearance, quietness, and assumptions that had never been tested. The truth was far different. Across the room, Aaliyah calmly collected her jacket from the bench where she had left it earlier. She folded it carefully over one arm. The same way she folded hospital blankets. The same way she approached everything in her life. With care. With intention. Without needing attention from anyone. A young student approached her hesitantly. "Why did you never tell us?" he asked. Aaliyah smiled gently. Nobody asked. The answer was simple. Honest. And somehow more powerful than any speech. Several students looked away, embarrassed by how quickly they had formed opinions. Others reflected on the jokes they had laughed at only minutes earlier. The older man who had recognized her nodded quietly to himself. The lesson unfolding inside the academy had become much larger than martial arts. It was becoming a lesson about humility. Ethan finally stepped forward. Every eye followed him. The confidence that had filled his voice earlier was gone. In its place stood something rarer. Self-awareness. He stopped a few feet from Aaliyah and looked directly at her. For a moment, neither person spoke. The fluorescent lights hummed softly above them. Outside, sunlight glimmered across parked cars in the lot. Inside, the academy waited. Ethan glanced briefly toward the stack of cash still resting untouched near the edge of the mat. The money suddenly seemed insignificant. What mattered now was the realization that respect could not be demanded. It had to be earned. And true strength was often found in people who never felt the need to announce it. As the silence stretched between them, everyone sensed the same thing. The challenge that began with pride was ending with understanding. And for the first time that morning, Ethan appeared ready to learn from the very person he had underestimated.